I'm going to admit Walter here from the
Yes.
waiting room. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first in our fall series of cultural sessions, concerts, and music making events from us at the Augusta Heritage Center. Today's session is brought to you by our generous sponsors over at the West Virginia Humanities Council. Augusta in general is sponsored by the National Endowment for the Arts, the West Virginia Department of Arts, Culture, and History, Davis and Elkins College, and of course you, the many individual contributors that make programming like this possible, free, and accessible. Today, I'm very happy to be speaking with Jennifer Lackey. She's a West Virginia native that comes to us from Birmingham, Alabama. We know her as a master loom weaver. She's taught for us at Augusta a couple years, but today she's going to speak with us about a very interesting topic down in Birmingham, Alabama, and she's much more well-versed in it than I am. But basically, today's talk is going to be about the Sloss furnaces and how arts can revitalize and reinvigorate communities in America. So without any further ado, I'll let the expert take over. Jennifer, thank you for being with us today.
All right. Thank you so much, Seth. I really appreciate being here. First thing I'm going to do is screen share so that you can see my slides as I get going. So hopefully this will work.
Looks great.
Okay, let me get that into presenter. There we go. All right, yes, so thank you for having me back. I have taught at Augusta, and this is also my third time to be giving a lecture here, which either means I'm doing pretty good or else you all haven't figured out I don't know what I'm talking about yet, but hopefully it's the former. And seriously, I really do love Augusta, and being here and getting to speak with you all is just an honor. I'm so proud to be able to be a part of this and to kick off this series. So tonight, I want to start with a question. What brings a community together? Shared resources, shared interests, certainly. In the past, we would also have gathered around a shared source of warmth, a blazing fire on a cold evening. In our present crisis right now, we are still seeking out sources of warmth, ability to connect and to comfort each other even in our isolation. And while it seems hard that our only comforting glow often comes from these electronic screens in front of us instead of a literal fire, what we're doing tonight, I think this ability to find connection and common humanity is still a precious, beautiful, and really needful activity in whatever form we find it, even if we are, as Seth was saying a little bit ago, being dragged, kicked and screaming into the 21st century to use this technology. So this idea of technology and it bringing us together is kind of a starting point for me, because one of the communities that I'm very involved in is the traditional fiber handcrafts. So think knitting and spinning and weaving, as Seth mentioned in my introduction. But don't get nervous. I know some of you are thinking, wait a minute, the advertising and that slide and all of this is talking about metalwork. And I'm sure that there are metal workers here thinking that that's what this is going to be about. And it is. It is not false advertising. Do not adjust your screens. But I am a fiber person. And so it's going to take me a little while to get there. But I promise that's where we're headed, to talk about metalwork and metal and this idea of arts and community. But just to make sure I do have a little bit of cred for any of the metal workers here, I want you to know my family runs a heating and cooling business up in Marianne County. And so I was playing with scraps of sheet metal and duct tape way before I ever learned to knit. So that's my claim to be able to talk about this. But I do consider the fiber crafts home. that is where I find my people. And it is also how I keep the people I love warm. And so just to show you some of my recent work, I have taken to making large pieces. These are 2 blankets that I recently made. One is a traditional coverlet, but the other one is a little more of kind of a contemporary look, which I may be blocking, so I'll scoot over a little bit. And that may seem odd to you, right? Because I do live in Alabama, and y'all, it's hot. It's really hot. So I'm not sure why I seem to be obsessed with making these blankets. And I didn't think I could make it living in Alabama. I really didn't. It is in many ways very, very different than where I grew up and where I'm used to being. Because after growing up in West Virginia, I lived in Baltimore for 14 years, and I really considered that home. So keeping with this idea and this theme of electronic connections, it was really the electronic sources I had that kept me in touch with my fiber friends in West Virginia and Baltimore that got me through the transition of living down here. Of course, eventually I was able to meet fiber folks here too. And as my 9-year-old calls them, they are my fuzz friends. So my group here consists of a guild, and we have several smaller groups that meet and do lots of things together. And that group has been really important to me. But I also find that even within that group that meets in person, that can gather together anytime we want, before the pandemic, of course, that even within that group, we use electronic means. And that juxtaposition of kind of the modern electronic tools and history, our ancient craft is kind of one of the themes that I'm talking about this evening. Because I do find that the fiber community embraces both, right? The historical and the antique, with the new and the electronic fiercely, right? They do that in this really fierce way. And to give you just one example, I want to talk just a little bit about a website called Ravelry. Some of you may already know this, especially if you are a handwork person, if you do knitting or spinning or any of those types of crafts. You can see from the little icons, this is their icon that they've got baskets full of yarn. And Ravelry is just a great example of the way the fiber community has embraced electronics. And it's really through this site that the collaboration with the Sloss Furnace Metal Arts program, it's really through this that began. So first, I'm just going to talk a little bit about Ravelry, and then I promise we're getting right on to talk an awful lot about Sloss. So Ravelry started in 2007. Facebook beat it by about 3 years, but I honestly think I had a Ravelry account before I had a Facebook page. And the impetus for creating Ravelry was to have a searchable online database for handwork patterns. But along with that came a platform for groups to form and discussion forums to take place. And it has been enormously successful. Let me say again, enormously successful. Right now, Ravelry has over 9 million people. There are close to 500,000 patterns that are housed there for download. And again, it's amazing to me that this incredibly high-tech, really state-of-the-art website, which handles all of this traffic and is able to navigate all of these patterns and all of these discussions and forums, is dedicated to people who are obsessed with sticks and string. Because that's what we're obsessed with, right? I often tease that Ravelry is granny crafts at 500 megabits per second, because that's what we do. And in fact, this past summer, they did an update to this new design, which had some problems in terms of accessibility. And I honestly thought that the community was just going to explode. It was just this incredibly huge thing. I don't think I quite realized, even knowing the numbers, how many people's lives are so touched by this online community, not only for their hobbies, but also as their livelihood, of people who sell patterns and do handcrafts in this really serious way. Okay, so it was through Ravelry that my group and myself that we met a dyer, a woman who dyes fiber, named Marianne Pagano. But actually, I shouldn't call her a woman, I should call her a genius, because she totally is. She's amazing. And if this is not your area, there's Marianne. Doesn't she look like the coolest person you just want to hang out with forever, right? So if you're not used to this or don't know about this area, those pictures surrounding Marianne are examples of her work. So she takes the wool or other fibers that would be spun into yarn, and she dyes them in these beautiful, luscious colorways. So if you've ever heard that term dyed in the wool, well, Marianne's the real deal, because that's what she does. She dyes it before spinners are then going to take it and turn it into beautiful yarn to then take and turn into other things. So Marianne is very well known within fiber circles, and she runs a business called Three Waters Farm, and that's where all of this roving or fiber comes to us from. And she has in the past worked with different groups to create specific colorways that are individual to those groups. And so our guild contacted her and asked if she would be willing to do that for us. And she was interested, and so we jumped at the chance to be able to work with her. And again, here's the point. I consider Marianne a friend. She's definitely part of my fiber community now, and I have never met her in person. Never. We weren't able to get her to come down and visit, although we tried to set that up. But all of this then happened through Ravelry. And all of this is what I want to be describing to you. As a group, the idea is that we would pick a topic, something related to our region or to our group, our community. And that within that theme, once we had settled on a theme, we would then pick photographs, suggest several different images, voting on the one we liked best, which Marianne would then dye fiber based upon. So we could have chosen anything. We certainly wanted a Southern theme. But again, this is a huge undertaking when you realize we have 232 online members that are all going to be engaged in this and all voting on this. But our online community could handle it. We set up discussion threads for the proposals of the theme. We eventually settled, well, we settled on two because we couldn't decide on a single one. And Marianne was incredibly generous enough to be willing to do two separate colorways or dyeing jobs for us. So our first theme that we decided on was Southern flowers and trees. And the second was Sloss furnace. See, I'm getting there. You didn't believe me, but I am. I'm coming back to that in just a second. But I thought I'd show you the flowers and trees first so you get the idea so that we can then move on and talk about Sloss. So we proposed lots of flowers and lots of different photos, everything from mimosas to the Cahaba lily, which is a very local flower. It only grows here at the Cahaba River in Alabama. But the winning photo, and again, we did all this through Ravelry, was the maypop, which should be right there at the bottom of your screen. I'd never seen one of these in the wild, and they're pretty wild. Look at that. So that's the flower. And this was a photo done by an amateur photographer named Robert D. Bruce in Florida. It was actually in his backyard, so they do grow that way. And I want you to see the roving that she dyed based on that color. Look at that, right? Is that luscious or what? All those purples and greens with these little pops of like the little tiny red that's right there in the middle of the flower. This is the kind of thing Marianne creates. She's just phenomenal, and we bought this up really quickly. But our other category, right? So our other category, we have finally arrived, is Sloss furnace. So here we are at this unique and amazing place. It's like nowhere I had ever seen before I moved here. But I'm really not sure that place is the right word for Sloss furnace, because I would rather refer to it as a community in that fullest sense of that word, because it goes so far beyond just this one particular site or place, reaches beyond that physicality to really the whole world, as I think you'll see. And so to understand why we as a bunch of spinners and knitters and weavers would choose this huge industrial cast iron blast furnace as the inspiration for dyeing wool, I think we need to learn some history and really think about how this place has changed over time. So that's my goal, is to kind of trace that for us tonight. So the Sloss furnaces were opened and started in the 1800s, 1882. And when I moved to Birmingham, just 5 or 6 years ago, I was actually really surprised that Birmingham was located here where it was. It didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. As a West Virginia girl, I kept saying, where's the river? right? Because, Fairmont and Morgantown on the mighty Mon, those were the cities of my childhood. The first truly big city I ever saw was Pittsburgh, and it has 3 rivers. So I just kept expecting some kind of feature like that to indicate why Birmingham would be where it was. And you may know Birmingham is called the Pittsburgh of the South because the feature I was missing, and I'm ashamed as a West Virginia girl, is the coal. This area is just incredibly rich. All under our feet are these huge coal fields. But they literally also have a mountain made of iron ore. And so Birmingham is situated right between these massive coal fields and this mountain called Red Mountain that is made up of all the raw materials you would need to make iron and steel. So Birmingham had it all and was able to situate itself right there at the right time. The late 1800s, there was this huge demand for iron and steel. And Birmingham was able to meet that demand richly so that the city grew incredibly fast. Birmingham's nickname is the Magic City, which I also didn't understand when I first moved here. But that refers to the fact that overnight it seemed to just appear out of nowhere, like magic. This city specialized in a certain kind of iron, though. It was foundry iron or pig iron. If we'd been together live in person, I would have totally played you Johnny Cash's Pig Iron song as everybody came walking in, if you know that Johnny Cash song, which I didn't know what pig iron was exactly until I moved here. So pig iron is a foundry iron is a really specific kind, and it was what these factories could specialize in because of the amount of phosphorus in the raw materials that are found here. So all the companies, lots of companies that would need that type of iron, like the cast iron pipe industry, it also moved here because the manufacturing was taking care of its material demands. So this whole industry, from the raw materials to the iron to the finished product, could all be in one place, which made it a really unique, really interesting system that has been studied a lot by industrial historians. It came into its peak over those next couple of decades. By the 1920s, this whole industry was massive, and it continued to be really strong into the 1950s as well. But by the 1960s, things are changing radically in so many ways in the country and certainly in this region. For the industry itself, iron ore became much harder to mine. It had been decades of taking iron ore out of the ground, and it became much more difficult. There are environmental regulations, needed environmental regulations being put into place, which also hurt the industry. And demand for the product was simply being reduced because products were no longer using cast iron as they had done in decades before. We were shifting to other types of materials. And there was lots of scrap iron around that you could continue to use and fabricate. It did not need to be poured and cast at the furnaces anymore. So many of the furnaces, many of this industry in Birmingham got shut down and completely torn down. They're just gone. But this one furnace, which was run by the Sloss Schofield Company, shut down in 1970, but did not tear itself down. They didn't tear it down. Instead, they donated it to the Alabama State Fair Authority. What are we going to do with this? This authority wasn't really sure where to go. The first idea was to create a museum. And you can see why, right? I mean, this is a massive place. Why I would be concerned, like, what are we going to do with it? It's huge. It's absolutely huge, right? So if you can see, these are catwalks, right? So that's a indication of the scale of this place. And so while they had thought about a museum at first, eventually most people felt that it just needed torn down, that it was time to just raise the factory, the furnace, reclaim the land to be able to bring new economic growth to the city, which was struggling in so many ways. I mean, why not? This place is defunct. It's a huge land resource. In order to have economic redevelopment, a good starting place would probably be to get rid of this thing, especially for the communities that were kind of most hurt by the way industry had gone in the South. There's one historian who feels, and I'm not sure how widespread his views are, but feels that it was the failure of the iron industry here that really helped kick off the civil rights movement to begin with. The factories could have switched to steel way before, but it stuck with pig iron, and that had led to their decline, which in turn caused the civil rights movement. Probably not that one-to-one or causal, but it is interesting, right? So almost immediately, the foundation or the Fair Authority decided they would have to tear it down. But, another but, in response to that, there was a huge groundswell of really outspoken advocates who felt that something important and meaningful would be lost if this amazing place was torn down. So I just want to show you some more pictures as we kind of go through this to show you the beauty of this site and the fact that it meant a lot to people who lived here. Almost everyone knew someone who had worked there, had an uncle or a cousin or a father who'd been part of this whole industry. And this was the last piece left. My husband, who is too young to remember this industry too much, since it closed in 1970. He was just a really small boy at the time. But he does have very strong memories, even as a 4 or 5-year-old, of driving over to the city. He grew up outside of Birmingham. Driving over to the city and seeing the entire night sky just ablaze with the fire red glow of these huge furnaces pouring molten hot iron out the chutes. So it meant a lot to people. It really did. And there was protests, people trying to get the authority to save the site in hopes of squashing that enthusiasm, really thinking that if we just let people come and see what horrible shape it's in, because it has now, by this time, as all of this has gone on, sat idle for many years, the authority decided to have tours of the site so people could come in and see how bad it was, see how derelict it was, and therefore they wouldn't want to save it anymore and they could just proceed with tearing it down. On one of these tours, a local businessman named Randall Oakes, who was interested in saving the furnaces, came to the tour, and as they were touring, he noticed that everyone in the group seemed to be sad about the way the tour guide was indicating all of the decay and that this was really the time to move on and get rid of this site. So at the end of the tour, according to Mr. Oakes, he asked the tour guide if he could borrow his megaphone, and he stood up on a truck and to the whole crowd that was assembled there said, "Who would like to help me save Sloss furnaces? Anyone who's interested, meet at my restaurant." And he claims that nearly 200 people showed up to that meeting. And after that, they formed the Sloss Furnace Association in order to preserve the furnace. They were going to have to get some powerful people on their side, so they appealed to the mayor, Mayor Van at the time, actually took up the cause and also believed in the project to save the furnaces. But they put it on as a bond vote and gave it to the people to make the final decision. And the bond was voted yes, so that they now had the funds. There was $3 million set aside to try and do something with Sloss furnaces. There were several missteps along the way. There was a consultant who came aboard the project named David McMullen, and he felt that the whole site could be turned into like a Disneyland park and attraction. And the drawings from that time period are just phenomenal. I'm not sure where he thought the money or the will was going to come from to do that. But at least at one point that was on the table. But by the early 1980s, 1981, 1982, the direction seemed clear. The will of the people seemed clear. What we really wanted to do was to save this place for historical preservation. So an architect was brought on board named Jim Walters, a local architect. And his firm set about trying to stabilize and preserve the site as it was, which I think is a really important and interesting fact about the whole transition. I mean, that may just be pragmatic. I don't know how you would restore this huge site to anything like a working furnace that is not needed. But it is true that they took as their aesthetic this driving idea of controlled decay. So they weren't going to stop it from decaying. They were just going to make sure it was safe and doing it in a controlled way. Try and steward and shepherd this hulking industrial beast into a new and different form. And that really leads us to the Metal Arts program. Paige Wainwright could possibly be seen as the founder of that program. She worked at Sloss Furnaces when it was opened in September of 1983 as a historical attraction. But she has always given credit to local artists because she claims upon opening, it was less than a week before the first blacksmith was knocking on their doors saying, "Hey, I'll trade you public demos for studio space." And it went from there so that the Metal Arts program just continued to grow and to grow and to grow over those next 5 years, so that in 1988, some artists from all over the United States had heard about Sloss and came here to set up the first international conference on contemporary cast iron art. Because for so long, if you wanted to work in something like cast iron as an artist, you would actually work in something like clay or some other medium that you could sculpt. And then you would rely on a huge foundry to cast that for you. You'd send off your model. But in the 1950s and 60s, as that industry was obviously dying, people started looking for ways to cast themselves. So people like Julius Schmidt, who was at Cranbrook at the time in Michigan, and Thomas Geip and some other artists throughout the country looked for ways to make furnace cast iron work on a small scale, to make smaller furnaces and be able to cast it more themselves. So Geip, who was at Southern Illinois University, realized that Sloss could be a home for that since it had been preserved and kept. So by 1988, he and others created this conference that brought the world together to this new art, really a new art. And so it's been this way for 3 decades now. And the Sloss furnaces have blacksmithing still, welding, and probably most prominently, this cast iron art movement. They have artists in residence who come and visit every year. There are school demonstrations, there are tours. There's a summer apprenticeship program for local high school students to be able to come and learn this art. I really think it just takes a lot of audacity to have turned this albatross of the Industrial Revolution into an art center that is, when you visit, an incredibly powerful and palpable feeling as you walk through this place. And I really think it reflects the audacity of the furnaces themselves. And this was an audacious part of the Industrial Revolution. As one of the artists has said about the furnace itself, who thought of pumping air into your furnace at 1,000 degrees to increase efficiency, right? I mean, that takes a lot of nerve and skill. So I love that about Sloss. But I also think it takes audacious thinking to reclaim a space that is also so haunted by the troubled history of exploitation and injustice that we certainly can't just gloss over as we give this history of an industry happening in a place like Birmingham, Alabama. Part of the transition that I think has taken place over the past 3 decades has been to honor, with an artistic voice, the voice of people who were so brutally denied a voice in the past. So the people, I think, who wanted to see this place torn down, who felt that need for the economic revitalization of the 1970s, who said, we don't need just another museum, right? We need jobs, come from that community for whom too long they had not seen any benefits of this country's progress. So when you think about it, right, Sloss was founded at the end of Reconstruction in the late 1800s or in the 1800s, and it certainly benefited from just horrific practices of minority exploitation, such as convict leasing. You may know, many of you may already know about this practice, but incarcerated men, specifically Black men, during this time period were leased out to local businesses as labor to help these businesses thrive, although the convicts were then being really pretty brutally treated. So just this past year, Sloss Furnaces has tried to, recently and rightly address some of this past violence This is an installation that was placed on the site. A historical marker just was placed in September of 2019 to honor two men who were lynched, not at Sloss, but at two mines that were owned by the Sloss Sheffield Iron and Steel Company. Their names are Jake McKenzie and Tom Redmond. I think it's really important to speak their names. So is it naive to think that an art center being put into this industrial center of iron producing could heal such ugly and deep wounds from the past? Perhaps, but it is a start. And I do think that Sloss is trying to make this a place of healing, because the faces that you see today involved in the metal arts programs are faces of women and minorities, people who were not involved in this kind of industry at all, but who can now claim it as their art. So cast iron is a really unique art in that it's not only open and welcoming to so many different kinds of people, but because it's such a collaborative art. It's one of the reasons I think that it is well suited to honor this aspect of its history. Because even though you're doing it on a very small scale, cast iron is just simply something you cannot do alone. I mean, look at that. It is still an incredibly intense procedure. They're all kitted out. There's several people. It is heavy. It is hot. You need a bunch of people to come in and do this if you're going to achieve your vision or what you want to create. So I see Sloss as a place that's dedicated now, not just to art, but to each other, the artists that are part of that community. Okay, so how does this all connect then to my community? Because as I said earlier, I am not a metalworker. I'm doing my best to struggle through and explain all of that to you. And so those of you who are metalworkers who are maybe watching and following along, if I messed up too bad, don't tell me. And don't ask me too many questions, because that whole phosphorus thing I said earlier, I don't understand that. So don't call me out on it. But no, I would do my best to answer any questions that you have. But here's what connected us, my fiber group, to this amazing place. It was that shared idea that creating beauty of any kind is foundational to what it means to be human. And that is incredibly beautiful, especially the beauty that you can create from your own hands. So I have a quote for you. Hands are magic. We can create anything with our hands if we are able to imagine it. And that's a quote from a man named Adrian Williams. And I want to ask you, do you think that was a fiber person or a metal person who said that? It's a metalworker. A metalworker who's using these big tools and these furnaces, and yet he's still focused on the magic of his hands, my hands, right? And so that beauty is what I think brings us all together and really does connect us, because obviously the mediums seem pretty far apart, right? You've got metal and you've got fiber. One is sharp and solid, and the other is soft and fluffy. But for me, the connections are really very clear. Both of these, right, creating pieces out of metal and creating pieces out of fiber, are ancient handcrafts that were taken over and usurped by the Industrial Revolution, and that are now carried on by individual artists, right? And that Industrial Revolution that kind of took it over, Sloss is part of that. But it is definitely true of both. So this is one of my favorite quotes, and many of you as artists and handcraft people that are interested in that will know this quote well, but it's from Eric Gill, and he said, "But though industrialism has now won an almost complete victory, the handicrafts are not killed, and they cannot be quite killed, because they meet an inherent, indestructible, and permanent need in human nature." I agree highly with that sentiment. So number one, I think these two crafts, metal and fiber, just share that past, right, of being taken over by industry and yet still striving along because they meet our human need. But I'd give a second reason too. I would add that I think both of these crafts are in some ways obsessed with that past industrialization, as well as the ancient traditions, right? So the ancient traditions combined with or juxtaposed with the technology of more recent years, that theme that I keep coming back to of kind of our modern tools and our modern tech and our kind of ancient practice. Because it's not an enemy, it's totally not an enemy. There's a fondness and respect for it, especially among my group. I'm a spinner, and that's one of my wheels on the screen in front of you. It's 100 years old. I spin on several 100-year-old wheels. I'm going to show you all my babies. They are Canadian production wheels, which I'll talk about in just a second, but there they are all lined up. So you can see all three of them. I say all three of them. There's actually four, but the other one's in West Virginia. I shouldn't admit to how many spinning wheels I have. These are just my antiques. I actually have 3 or 4 others too, but that's right. Don't tell my husband. They're hiding all over the place. Okay, so, but I do spin on these 100-year-old wheels, which were made in Canada. All three of these were produced in Canada, and they are antiques. I love antiques, I really do. I mean, part of why we get involved, I think, in handcrafts like spinning or knitting, is because it connects us to that really ancient past. We've been making thread, turning it into material to protect ourselves and keep us warm for millennia. And I think those tools then retain some of that memory and even carry that competence forward to us. They just spin well. That's the bottom line of that. They've been used for a long time and they know what they're doing. But let me make this clear, right? So that's kind of my connection to the ancient, to this old technology of how you might make thread. But notice these are 100-year-old spinning wheels, not 200-year-old spinning wheels, which means they were made at the same time Sloss Furnaces was at its peak. In fact, one of the wheels that's pictured here is probably made in the 1920s or 30s. Maybe you didn't know that wheels were still being made right through that time period. And in fact, I mean, they're obviously still being made today too. But what I love about these wheels specifically is that they do ride that line between handcrafts at a time when every single spinning wheel would have been made from start to finish by somebody's hand, and factory produced industrialization. Because if we take a closer look, you can see these wheels have cast iron parts. That's right, folks. They're actually utilizing the kind of materials that Sloss Furnace was churning out. And in fact, a few years ago, a modern wheel maker named Dave Paul from Merlin Tree wanted to reproduce these kinds of wheels. And he contacted Sloss and had them make iron fittings for his reproductions. So there's a direct connection from these wheels to the Sloss furnaces. But these are beasts. They have these really heavy treadles. That's where your foot goes. If you see right down here, that would be where your foot is going to make the wheel go around. There's also this iron fitting. I took one off. I could also show it to you, right? This thing weighs almost a pound. This is heavy stuff. And it's what clamps the top of this part of the wheel to the rest of the wheel so that it will function. I spoke last year about spinning wheels and spent an awful lot of time talking about Canadian production wheels, so I'm not going to go too much into their history or their story, but here's why they're fascinating. They were made in a part of Canada where most other industry had seemed to fail. Fur trapping was kind of at its end. Agriculture was not suitable to this area of Quebec. And so people living in this area really had no economic recourse at the time. And so they turned back to handcrafts and attempted to compete with the Industrial Revolution in making cloth and yarn, which I find fascinating. And there were dozens of wheel makers living right there in this area of Quebec, churning out these wheels in order for home production, this cottage industry, to take place again as late as the 1890s into the 19-teens. And to be able to do that, they were making these wheels by utilizing factory-made parts. So the wheels themselves, right, there's the better look at the treadle. The wheels themselves are turned. You can see the beautiful wood spokes in the back, and they still have this, hand-done lathe work. But they had these really sophisticated iron fittings. So this one actually works slightly differently. It's a little cradle that's holding the wood piece. And then there's a strap, a metal strap that kind of muffles down and holds it taut. Because the way these wheels work is that has to tilt in order to make the spinning take place. Yeah, I have enough time. I brought my wheel down and I wasn't going to spin for you unless there was enough time, but I think I've got enough time. So I'm going to give you a different view real quick.
Yay!
Yay! And I'm going to actually sit at the wheel. I think you can all still hear me and see me. But
Yes.
big beauties. And again, those of you who are metal people are like, no, now she's spinning for us. That's not right. We were here to see metal. I want you to see what I'm really doing is showing you how efficient these parts are. And this big treadle that my foot is on and this huge wheel is the fastest spinning wheel that was ever created. It's still a model for some of the hand makers today because it just has an amazing ability to spin really, really fast. Something we couldn't have done before these iron fittings. They make the treadle really heavy and they can make that wheel spin really efficiently and really quickly. And again, the part I was talking about here, this clamp, it allows this whole mechanism to tilt forward and back, which is what's giving me enough tension to turn my fluff into a string, which again is kind of a transformation along the lines of what we've been talking about. Fluffy and soft, and now we have this nice, strong, heavy thread that can take right off the wheel.
Do you adjust the angle of that piece based on the consistency of the yarn that you're spinning, or?
That's part of it, because you want to have a certain speed, but it's also just as the bobbin fills up, it needs to have a lag, and so you give it more tension to kind of speed up the wheel. Yeah, so there's the yarn I just made.
Very cool. Very fast.
Very fast. Thank you, Sloss Furnace. All right. So if you want to know more about Canadian production wheels and how they fit into that place and that time, that history, it's a great story and it has a lot of details and interesting things about it. So that's what I think, when I think of fiber people being obsessed with that juxtaposition of the past, of our tradition, but also of industrialization. But obviously it's true at Sloss and the metal workers there as well, or they wouldn't be beating down the doors to get to work in that place. The tools and the traditions of their ancient practice are being married with that industrial space and that industrial practice too, that juxtaposition. So the Metal Arts program is really embedded in that place and in that decaying structure. Remy Heinemann, who's one of the artists who's worked at Sloss for a long time, talks lovingly about the wheels and the gears and the rust and how that is the inspiration for the art he creates. In fact, he said, you don't have to work here long for rivets to start finding their way into your work. Because if you go to the site, and I invite all of you to come down, you have a place to stay, come see Sloss. Rivets are everywhere, as well as the rust. And so it is just part and parcel of what these artists are attempting to create there. It really does make it into their work. The beauty of this behemoth, the slowly decaying phenomenon of the Industrial Revolution. It is full of color and shape and rust and shadow, which is the perfect inspiration in any medium, metal or fiber. So now I think you can see how this became inspiration for our community to create some fiber based on Sloss. So we've come to the end of our story. This is the winning photograph of Sloss Furnace that we presented to our dyer, Marianne, to create a colorway on. It is one of dozens that we could have chosen. I really think Sloss is a photographer's paradise. I'm not a photographer myself, but I have several friends who are, and they adore coming to Sloss, the colors and the shapes. Right, this was a photo by a professional photographer named Brad Mitchell. And I just love it, right? It's so energetic and full of sharpness and angles and color, and it's incredibly vibrant. So are you ready? You ready to see the fiber that was made from this? Marianne did such an amazing job. Drum roll, please. There it is. Ah, so beautiful. And it's so different in a way, right? It's soft and fluffy, and it's kind of swirly and round versus the angularity and the sharpness of the photo. But in some ways, it's the same. It's still the same thing, or it's all part of the same thing. They feel like they go together. And she's amazing. I don't know how she did it. But you should see where it went from there, right? Because that's just the first step. Her amazing color sense led to this amazing yarn. So that's what it looks like when it was spun up by one of our members. Claire Clifford did that spinning. And I really think if you think back to that photo I showed you earlier of the people pouring the iron, it looks like molten iron. I mean, it has such movement and energy and heat to it. I just adore it. Here's another picture of it wrapped in a skein, ready to be taken and made into a project. And in fact, I do have a picture of that as well. This is a shawl that was crocheted by one of our members. That's her spinning at the top. Her name is Mary Spanos, and she's our current president. So you can see how it looks then, as it goes out into a shape. And it all came from that photo, right? So there you can see the photo again with a finished product and some of the yarn that was created from it. But my slideshow is a little incomplete because I can't show you what we had originally intended when we started this whole thing, which was to create an art installation at the furnace itself. In their gallery, right next to the iron sculptures, we wanted our pieces of shawl work or the yarn or woven pieces to be on display. And Sloss was thrilled and excited to house that there at their facility. Of course, the pandemic stopped all of that. And I don't have pictures for you. I can't show you Mary wearing that shawl, walking through the grounds of Sloss Furnace. But I think someday I will, because this won't stop us. Like a well-spun thread or a cast iron sculpture, the relationships and the connections that were made through this whole collaboration are incredibly strong. And to that point, I want to show you one final thing. Marianne actually created a companion colorway to go with the Sloss Furnace color. So you can see the Sloss on the right swirled together with this colorway on the other side of your screen, which she just called Rust. Of all the colors and concepts she could have pulled out, why Rust? That seems to emphasize the decay, right? And it's true, Sloss no longer lights up the night sky with fire like it used to in my husband's childhood. And it will eventually completely rust away. And all of these things that we've created with our hands will pass. But the love and the community that grew around them cannot pass away. The warmth that these now cold furnaces created in our world, both here and everywhere, will last. Thank you.
Yes, that was wonderful.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was really compelling.
Are there questions? Did anybody who joined want to ask a question or?
Yes.
But I
Oh,
do
sorry.
want to let the Facebook Live folks know that we're monitoring that, and if you put a question in the comments live right now, we'll answer it. Of course, that has a little time sensitivity to it. I guess.
Oh, sorry. I have a few questions. So are there studios, are all the studios for metal workers? I know you said that the first, the blacksmith came knocking, and so are there other artist studios in there besides metalwork, or just metalwork in this loss?
It's all metalwork. So blacksmithing, welding, and then the cast iron pouring. That's what they do there. But when we approached them with this idea, because they didn't know that we were using them and, you know, having a dyer create this for us. And when I sent the email to say, would you be interested? I was very hesitant because I thought these big, tough metal workers are going to laugh us out of their space, right? And it just so happens that the woman who's the curator there is also a knitter. So she was excited and she invited us to come and talk and to think about possibilities. And when we got there, I thought, yeah, but she's going to introduce us to like the dudes out in the shed that are like working the, you know, stuff. And as I said in the presentation, it wasn't like that at all. There are lots of, there's lots of diversity there, lots of women working there, lots of people of color working there. And they were extremely excited about fiber. They got so into it, you know, as they're standing there covered in like, you know, all of this soot from doing their blast furnace work. They want to like touch and feel our stuff. They're like, oh, it's so soft. So they really embraced us. So while that's the only type of art going on at the site, they really do want to be connected, I think, to other arts and open that door. So, yeah.
Has the repurposing of the Sloss furnaces into studio space had any impact on the immediate community around the Sloss furnaces?
Yeah, I think so, especially through that youth apprenticeship program, because I think the students who are involved in that come from right around in the local community, you know, and it has really, I think, had an impact.
Furnaces into studio space.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. So yes, I definitely think so. You know, again, I'm awfully new to the community, so I'm sure that given the fact it was a controversial thing when it happened in the 70s, that there's probably still some controversy over it. But for the most part, it seems to be a place that people are behind because it's used in lots of other ways too, which I didn't focus on in my presentation. But there's a huge music festival that happens there every year, where they bring in all kinds of bands and they play in the big casting shed. And I mean, it's huge and really incredible. You know, as I said, school trips come there, you know, so there's this new visitor center that I showed in the image. So people come there just, you know, to also be out and, you know, and enjoy the grounds. So it's functioning in all kinds of ways. They even do a fright furnace during the month of October where they, you know, set it up as like a haunted walkthrough, which was really interesting. I take people there anytime anybody comes to town to visit. I'm like, we're going to Sloss. Even if they've seen it before, I make them go. And I took my very best friend there just last year, and it was the middle of the day. We didn't pay tickets to go through the haunted part, but they still kind of had it all set up. And so we were walking through all of these decorations, you know, for this haunted thing. And it was interesting that the fabricated stuff wasn't nearly as like compelling and spooky and intense as the real stuff. Like I just kept thinking, don't build anything, just walk people through this thing at night because it is such an amazing place to be in. So there's all kinds of activities happening at this place. I think draws in the community.
How big is the site?
It is huge. It is really huge. It's I don't think any of my pictures did it justice. I started, when I was putting my slides together, I just started pulling picture after picture after picture. I was like, I've got to give them the scope of this. I've got to try and show them how big this site is, what it feels like to walk through there, but there's no way to capture that with a photo. So I eventually gave up and just showed what I could. But it is 2 full blast furnace setups. So you've got the towers, which again, I'm not an expert on the technology. You've got the cooling towers, the actual furnace, and then the 2 areas where the iron gets poured out in the sheds that would run down. That's why it's called pig iron, because it would pour out into this slope where they would dig little grooves, and the iron would run and settle into those little grooves in the sand, and they looked like little baby piglets all laying out through the sand. So that whole area, and then beyond it into the cooling ponds, it's huge.
It sounds like an absolute gold mine for certain styles of photography and exploration. Are you allowed to walk around the grounds, or are there
Yes.
guided tours? Or
Oh no, yeah, well, they do have tours. At least they have. I think they're planning to maybe reopen the end of this month to some of that. But before the pandemic, yeah, you could just walk through it. They would have some places that were marked off, right, for safety issues. But you can even kind of go down and underneath into some of the underground tunnels. You can go up into some of the buildings and really see some of the machinery. Yeah, you've got a surprising amount of access when you walk through this place, because that was their goal, right? To stabilize it enough that people could actually be in and through the structure.
I could see why the photographer that took the winning photograph was so drawn. I mean, it was, I'm sure there are just hundreds of angles of richness. And that concept of controlled decay, um, it does lend itself to some sort of certain aesthetic quality. I've heard Venice described like that.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're there, you can experience that. There are certain towns in West Virginia, I won't call them out right now, but I do believe that that is an aspect that draws people to those towns. And there's some kind of certain beauty, some kind of fleeting feeling you get when you're looking at something that's like that, that's man-made, that's slowly being swallowed back into nature. Um,
Yeah, for
I don't
sure.
know. Maybe another language has a word for that feeling,
Right. Yeah.
but English
Yeah.
isn't coming up with one. Um, but that just popped out at me. Like that would just be an
Yeah.
incredible place to walk around, and the rivets and all the different structures,
Yeah.
industrial structures, looked so cool and compelling.
It really is. And there are places where nature is, aggressively fighting to take it back over, where grass has already started to come in. And I think they navigate those choices really carefully of like how much do we beat that back and not let, vines grow up on the brick buildings versus allowing that to happen somewhat naturally too. So, it's an interesting space because those juxtapositions themselves are just so beautiful. The plants, when you see some vines that have started and it changes a little bit every time you visit, and yet you want to try and preserve it. So finding that line between the two is really interesting.
Yeah. We have Walter commenting in from Pittsburgh, and he says, well, he had commented during the presentation when he saw the pictures of the Sloss furnaces. Oh my gosh, looks just like home because
Yeah.
you have that industrial feeling. And he just said that in Pittsburgh the mills ran for 20 miles along the rivers. So
Wow.
it's really all encompassing image there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
once
interesting.
I once I kind of discovered this about Birmingham, I felt much more at home than I'd ever thought I would when I moved here.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking you well, two questions, but do you know if they do like one-time workshops? I know you said the apprenticeship program sounds more ongoing.
Yeah, I think there are like specific classes. They have an amazing website.
Yeah,
You
we'll
can
have to
go to
check that out.
their website, yeah, and click the Metal Arts program. They've got all kinds of events and classes and things listed there. So definitely check it out. And they travel around too. There's an art festival that happens up in Tuscaloosa, where the University of Alabama is, the Kentucky Art Festival, and they bring a furnace up there, one of their small furnaces. They bring it up there and do demos all through the art festival and let people do their own casting. They give you molds and you can like scratch into it, and then they'll pour the metal right there while you watch, and then you get to take it home with you. It's really cool. So
Very cool.
yeah, so they definitely want people to be interacting with the art and learning. So that's one of their goals for sure.
Yeah. Um, I was I was struck by I think I noticed this in all sorts of traditional artists. Seth and I are both musicians, so we focus on music a lot, but traditional musicians and traditional um, uh, hand artists, physical artists, are it's so interesting how drawn we are to place and to like a play and just the whole project of finding of creating fiber dyed with a colorscape of your local area is like just I think it that resonates with a lot of traditional artists of
Yeah.
many forms. I think everyone's there's someone's always showing a fiddle or a guitar made from red spruce found right here on like one mountain over or or something along those lines. that
Yeah.
idea of making art out of what is around you, I think is a particular um, just love of traditional artists. Probably other artists too, but as traditional artists, I
Yes.
think we revere place in that sense.
Definitely. Yeah, for sure.
Cool. Well, did you have any other questions, Seth?
No, I just wanted to say thank you so very much, Jennifer. This is first in a series of cultural sessions, concerts, and music making events that Augusta Heritage Center will be hosting throughout the fall. And what a kickoff it was! I
Yeah.
mean, that was just such a wonderful presentation. I if you would have asked me 24 hours ago if I wanted to go down to Birmingham, Alabama and visit an old furnace, I probably would not put that at the top of the list, but do not be surprised if you see me down there wandering around the beautiful decay and taking some photos and trying my hand at some metalwork. I mean, it,
Well,
it
give me a
really did.
call. I'll take you out for barbecue while you're here.
You know, all the better. You
Yeah.
have me now. You found my kryptonite. Um, but from the bottom of our hearts, Jennifer, thank you. And I can't wait to get you back up here to Elkins, teaching something in the textile arts. It just what you're doing down there is just absolutely incredible work, and it is. You are certainly a culture bearer. I will tell you that, and
Mhm.
so you're welcome up here in Elkins, the Augusta Heritage Center, anytime. And any potential students out there, I gotta say, be very lucky to spend a week with Jennifer Lackey up here in Elkins, West Virginia, listening to music and hand weaving and spinning uh, yarns. And I'm going to get out of my element really quickly here. Textile arts. So I'll leave it up to you. But I do know that you are something special. And thank you so very much for being with
Well,
us tonight.
thank you. This
Yeah.
was a joy. It was a real pleasure to share all of this with you. I just love Augusta. So thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you. And of course, we want to say a big thank you to the West Virginia Humanities Council that is sponsoring this and talks throughout the fall and into the spring. They've allowed us to pivot to online delivery for our humanities talks for this year, which is so wonderful. And we're just, uh, it makes pandemic living just seem a lot richer and be a lot richer.
We'd also like to thank all of our individual sponsors that have been coming forward to contribute to the Augusta Heritage Center. Your support, coupled along with the West Virginia Humanities Council, we can't forget the National Endowment for the Arts and the West Virginia Department of Arts, Culture, and History, and of course, Davis and Oaks College, keep these discussions free and open to the public. And we would like to continue this series indefinitely because there certainly is a lot to talk about. So anybody that had a hand in helping us out and make these drastic pivots during this unprecedented time, thank you very much. And know that we have priorities that are going to guide us through this pandemic, and that is to keep teachers teaching, students learning, and communities connected by any mechanism at our disposal. And right now, that means Zoom. But the silver lining is that Jennifer can come to us from Birmingham, Alabama. Emily and I are in Elkins, West Virginia, and you get to be wherever you are. And we can safely have these discussions in the interim until we can gather once again. So with that said, I don't even know if I have the authority to do this. I might just be a talking head in a box here, but I think we're going to sign off and end the
Seth is cutting out, but I'm going to say I'll finish his sentence, which is that we're going to end the meeting now. But thank you all so much for joining us, and we will see you at another event.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.